The Utah Utes are set to take on the UCLA Bruins, but which Utes are in for a big game? Will Cam Rising have another outstanding effort? And on defense, who's it going to rise up to the occasion and be able to bring down DTR and slow down the Bruins offense? We're talking about it on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everyone. My name is JT Wistrcill, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by Underdog. Underdog Fantasy has you guys covered. Sign up at UnderdogFantasy.com with the promo code Locked On and get your first deposit doubled up to $100. On today's show, we're going to be talking about which Utes are in for a big day on offense, defense, as well as any other phase we think guys are just going to have a strong outing as the Utes return to Pasadena. And in order to help us do that, bringing back friend of the show, FanNation AllUtes editor, Cole Bagley. Cole, appreciate you joining us. And this one for Utah on offense, I think is going to be a big game. I really do. I feel like this is the game we're going to see all of the offense come together. And like, it's important to keep in mind to remember, like, this is a different UCLA team. I just feel like than we've seen in the past. I feel like the momentum they're riding high and coming in. And most importantly, they don't have to come to Rice Eccles. I think that's where things really went wrong for UCLA in the past. They had to deal with that crowd noise. I think DTR is coming off an outstanding game versus Washington, where you look at some of those Heisman moments he had. I think he's hungry to have a couple more of those against a really good team in the Utes. This is one of the things that's going to be tough for the Utes the rest of the season. It's kind of been that way all season already as well. It's one of the reasons they lost to Florida, even though Florida's not a great team. Is teams get amped up to play this Utah team when you're defending Pac-12 champions, as well as even this year, you're a really good team. You're still the 11th ranked team in the country, the highest one-loss team in the country for good reason, as well as we saw what they did against Oregon State. You're going to get teams best punch, and I don't expect that to change versus UCLA. So I do think the Bruins are going to come out fired up, and I think this one will be closer than it's been in the past. But looking at things from the offensive side of the ball, I just think Cam's in for a big game. How many times have we talked to Cam, and you can tell, like, we talk about Utah fans are still excited about the Rose Bowl, just making it there, almost beating Ohio State, and Cam is just mad. He's still just like, no, we lost it. He still views that game as a failure. So he has an opportunity to get back in that stadium with, I think he said, a ton of families going to be there. I believe his high school is only 90 minutes away or something close.
Like 80 miles.
80 miles. Yes, thank you, Cole. Yeah. So not far at all. He's going to have a ton of family in there. I really think Cam is going to have a big game in this one, getting it done with his legs, as it was so great to see him. Especially he had a touchdown run where he, a little reminiscent to his one he had in the Rose Bowl as well, where he broke a couple tackles down the sideline and then took it in where it just didn't look like he was going to be able to get in. He's done that twice now. I really felt like the last one was in Pasadena, the Rose Bowl, and then most recently the one versus Oregon State. So I just really think Cam's in for a big game on Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the statistics, UCLA is allowing, a lot more passing yards than they are rushing yards.
293 passing yards. 237 passing yards they're allowing to just 80 rushing yards.
Right, per game. So I think that's obvious. Like, Cam is going to get his yards. I think he's going to get a few touchdowns. So I agree that Cam is probably going to have a big game, but for me, what is going to make the biggest difference is whether or not the run game, namely Tavion Thomas, is able to come out and have a big game, right? Like, of course, if you're a football team and you're only allowing 80 yards per game on the ground, you're not going to lose a lot of football games. If teams are not able to get even close to 200 yards, you're going to have a pretty, easy time winning those games. And so, for me, the deciding factor is whether or not, Utah's run game is going to pick it up. And that's all relative. I mean, yeah, they struggled last game, but I believe that through the first 5 games, and I think Josh Furlong actually tweeted this out earlier today. He was looking at the statistics of, Utah's rushing through the first 5 games of the last 4 seasons. This year is second amongst those last few seasons. I think they've actually scored the most touchdowns rushing wise over the last few seasons this year compared to any other season. And then in terms of yards, it's second. I think over the last 4 or 5 seasons is what he did. So, sure, they had a bad game last game, but even Whittingham said, "Hey, Oregon State's linebackers are all conference," and I'd have to agree with that. The way that they were filling those gaps, and they were not allowing anything past their territory of the field. Um, they're gonna, it's tough, right? And I even talked to Jalen Glover yesterday, and he said, and I asked him, I said, "What, you guys have kind of somewhat struggled with the last two games. What do you feel like the reason for that is?" He's like, "Look at what Tavion did last year. Teams are scheming for that this year. You
Mhm.
know, they know to expect. We're Utah. They know to expect a heavy rush game, anyways. But secondly, when you have a guy that does what Tavion did last year, they're scheming for him. And so even if I get in or Makai gets in or whatever, they are scheming and expecting a talented running back coming out of the backfield. So, you know, it's nothing to be alarmed about. I expect Utah to get, back on track. And yes, Cam's going to have a big game, but the deciding factor for me is whether or not the running backs, get on track. I think if they can get over 200 yards, Utah's going to win this football game.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I do think the running backs are gonna get on track in this one. I think a big reason why is gonna be the offensive line. I mean, Coach Whittingham kinda called them out and said, "Hey, we're not doing a good job getting to the second level in those zone blocking situations," and that's something you really
Right.
see on film as well. Even just I mean, usually Coach Whittingham's the kinda guy as well. He made that comment, I believe, after in his post-game press conference. That's usually a comment you would expect a coach to make after he's watched the film on Monday. So it just shows you how
Right.
glaring of an issue it was. He was able to notice it right after the game. So I really think that offensive line group is gonna take that challenge. This is a team that the unit that's continuing to come together and really grow. And I think for them, especially, I think this was a huge jump in talent, like taking on Oregon State versus their past opponents in terms of defensive line talent. I think that was a big jump up. And I think this team, I don't know if they have as talented defensive line as the Beavers do, but it's in this, I do think it's better than Arizona State or anyone else they've played outside of the
Yeah.
Florida game, of course. So I
Right.
do think it's going to be interesting to see how this unit does. And I do think Tavion's going to have a good game. I think the offensive line is going to have a good game as well. I think Makai is going to continue to be effective running the ball. He had the first big play of the third quarter when he broke those two tackles and got Utah first down. And then from there, they put together their best offensive drive of the day. That was the only time they scored, I believe, that it wasn't set up by a turnover. And not saying it's a
Right.
bad thing that they capitalized on those turnovers, but it was nice to see them get it done because a couple of those other situations, whether it was after a kickoff or a punt, they just weren't able to capitalize on. So I do expect Tavion to have a big day as well. And I don't think he'll be the only skill position guy because I'll throw in these two guys as well. I said, I think Cam's going to have a big day. I think Devon finally cracks 100 yards. He's been so close now a couple times. So we'll finally see him get over 100. And I think we're going to see Dalton have a big game as well. I could see Dalton going for 2 touchdowns in this one. And I could even see him going over 100 as well. This could be the game where Cam has 2 receivers go over 100 yards. And I don't know if that's ever happened for him, but I just think when you're dealing with a Bruins secondary that is not as strong as Oregon State's, I mean, they're not as strong as Oregon State's defense. Let's get that out of the way
Right.
as well. I honestly just think this offense is going to feast in this one.
Yeah, I mean, and I think when you kind of look at UCLA's schedule, they're 5-0 and they've
It's
destroyed
yes.
their opponents, but it's Bowling Green, Alabama State, South Alabama, Colorado, and Washington. Washington obviously being one of the closer contests, and they only beat South Alabama at the buzzer on a field goal, 32-31. So I think UCLA is a bit of a fraud. I do think
Mhm.
this is going to be a more closely contested game, than we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years with UCLA. Utah's just had their number. Um, I'm thinking maybe 10 to 14 points in favor of Utah. It's just you look at their and you can argue that Utah hasn't played necessarily the greatest teams either, but they have completely annihilated those teams, and they haven't allowed a lot of points either. I think they've outscored their opponents like 184-43 since the Florida game. Meanwhile, sure, UCLA is putting up points 45, 45, 32, 45, 40, but they're also allowing 31, 17, 32 in those games. And those, like I said, that South Alabama, I've never even heard of that school,
I know.
and they beat them by a single point at the end of the game. So, it's I really think that, if we're looking at kind of those top 3 or 4 teams, Utah, USC, UCLA, Oregon. I think that UCLA is the biggest fraud remaining. Washington was obviously, called out this last weekend by UCLA. I think Utah is going to, show UCLA for what they really are, and I just don't think that they're necessarily a top 15 football team, and I don't think that they're in the top three, for the Pac-12. And so, while people might say, "Hey, Utah hasn't necessarily played a super strong schedule outside of Florida," Okay, well, UCLA hasn't really played a strong schedule for that. Overall, they played the worst team in the Pac-12 and
Yep.
3 joke schools. So,
Yeah.
you know, I think that Utah's defense is going to, hold UCLA under 30 points. And I think Utah's offense is going I think we're going to see maybe a similar performance that we did last week. Defense causes a couple turnovers, Utah's offense cashes in. Maybe we're looking at a, 42-30 football game, or a 45-30 football game. That's kind of what I'm looking at.
Yeah, I think that's a good range to be in, and I'm just looking at the schedule even right now myself, and the toughest game that either of these two teams have had to play so far is still going to Florida. I know that Florida team is not as good as this Washington team in a vacuum this year, but when you get them at home later in the season as well, it's just you factor in all those circumstances of the Florida game. First game of the head coach's 10-year season opener, all of that, the heat, the humidity, such a different climate, all of that. It makes it a tougher game to me than hosting Washington at home. And then obviously the Oregon State game was really challenging as well. And even games like Arizona State, obviously better than Colorado, as you mentioned, and San Diego State. I still feel like that's better than anyone else that UCLA played in their non-conference schedule too. So I think you make a really good point about this team. I don't feel like they're not a bad team, and you didn't say that either. But they're not a top 15 team, and I do agree with that as well. And I think the Utes are going to show that they're a not top 15 team. Although I would appreciate it if after the Utes do kind of roll over them, they do kind of look like a really good team still, because then that would obviously help the Utes as well. And you talked about Utah's defense. We're going to talk about a couple of guys on that side of the ball that we think are going to break out in just a second. But first, want to tell you guys a little bit more about Underdog. This episode is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy, the easiest place to spice up the college football seasons. Guys, head over to Underdog where you can easily create an account and look at the different pick'em choices for your team each week. Make sure you guys head over, look at it, see if you guys think Cam Rising's in for a big game, Tavion Thomas is in for a big one. Is Devon Vele going to have an outstanding game as well? You guys can head over to Underdog. It's super easy. It's easy to play and available in over 30 states. Just pick between 2 to 5 players across any team. So that's right. If you guys think maybe you guys just want to be like, oh, I think Charbonnet is going to have a good one, even though Utah's going to win, you can go over and include him in your five lot person lineup. So go head over and decide if they will finish higher or lower than their stat total for that's each player individually. One of the easiest fantasy games to play out there, and you can win cold hard cash in a single game. Sign up with promo code Locked On, one word, all caps, Locked On, and Underdog will double your first deposit up to $100. Deposit $100, get a free $100. Go to UnderdogFantasy.com or find the Underdog Fantasy app in the App Store, Google Play Store. CTA repeated, that's Underdog Fantasy, promo code Locked On. Once again, one word. So get in on the college football pick'em action today. So make sure you guys head over to Underdog Fantasy and get in on all that great action. And you can't do I mentioned you can do Charbonnet's numbers as well. And I do expect this Bruins offense to put up some points a little bit. As we mentioned, this is a Utah defense that has completely shut them out in the past. But I do think this UCLA offense is going to move a little bit. I think this is going to be the most yards that Utah's secondary has given up through the air so far. And I don't think it's a knock on them. I just think this is the best passing quarterback they've played so far. And that's not even necessarily DTR's strength. I just still feel like he's going to have a good game versus, I know Anthony Richardson had an outstanding game versus Utah, but I think he still only threw for 169 yards.
Right.
And yes, we
No,
saw
no touchdowns either, right?
exactly. Yeah. And we saw the Beavers move the ball a little bit, but you just see some of the mistakes. RJ Hubert made a great play on that interception. The OSU backup quarterback, and whose name is escaping me just off the top of my head right now, he absolutely stared down the receiver the entire way. That's just not a mistake I expect DTR to make. Now, could he still throw an interception? Yeah, I think he will. I think this is too good of a secondary. And look, DTR should know after watching the film, wherever
Don't
number one
throw
is,
at number one.
exactly. Yeah, I'm not throwing to that guy because you saw how many times Oregon State made that mistake. But I do think Charbonnet is going to have an all right game. We saw this Utah run defense. They gave up a couple yards as well. But in terms of who's going to have a really good game in this one, I really think Mohamoud Diabate is. I think Diabate didn't have he had some really nice plays. He had 4 tackles for loss in this previous one, but Coach Witt said he played okay. He said he made some nice things, did some bad things. I think his athleticism is really going to pop in this game, and he's going to be flying around the field, making some plays as well. I would also love to see him get a couple opportunities to spy, and I think he'd do a really good job. And I think he wants another opportunity to spy a quarterback after what happened in that Florida game where he was one of the ones, and he was the main guy actually involved in the highlight where Richardson kind of spun in air and avoided too. That was Diabate was the first one there. So I think he'd be hungry, and I think he would do a good job tracking down DTR as well. So I think Diabate is actually going to lead this team in tackles in this one.
Yeah, I mean, he's due for it. I was looking at the top 5 leading tacklers, and despite missing a few games, Diabate I think is 5th. Um,
Mm.
you've got Corene Reed up there, Cole Bishop, of course. JT Broughton was actually up there as well, and I think RJ Hubert. So a lot of secondary guys, which isn't necessarily great. You don't really want your secondary leading in terms of tackles. That means that they're getting past the first and second lines of defense. But Diabate is definitely he's in for a big game. He kind of had this last game to get himself reacquainted with the speed of play. Witt said that he was a little sluggish, that he hadn't quite reacclimated, but I mean he still had a great game last game, and he definitely is due for a much bigger performance. For me, I think Cole Bishop is going to have his best game of the season so far.
Ooh, that's
And
he's been outstanding too.
yeah, and I think he's going to cause a turnover, whether it's a forced fumble or an interception. I think
Mhm.
Cole Bishop is going to have his best game of the year. And yeah, he's been absolutely outstanding. I mean, he leads the defense in terms of tackles. He's been great. Corene Reed is right there with him, but I think Cole Bishop is the guy this week that has the biggest game for Utah's defense. And but kind of like I did talked about earlier, I'm banking on Cole having the biggest game, but I think who needs to have the biggest game and what's going to come down to is that defensive line. I saw on Twitter, I think it was yesterday, someone said, that the defensive line is overrated, and I would disagree with that. I would say they're underperforming.
Mhm.
To me, that's what's going on here. I don't think that they're overrated at all. I think this is one of the most talented defensive lines Utah's ever had. I just think they're underperforming. And that has a lot to do with they face some pretty decent offensive lines. Florida, really good
Mhm.
offensive line.
The
Oregon
Beavers.
State, yeah, really good offensive line. And you've seen what they've done in the games that the teams haven't had good offensive lines. SUU, San Diego State, Arizona State. Like it, you can't expect a team to be just killing it every single game. Position group. You know, but to me, that's the deciding factor here is the defensive line really needs to clog up holes, clog up gaps. Don't let DTR get free. Have that. Whatever you got to do to contain him. That's a guy that likes to scramble. He likes to move to the
Mhm.
outsides. So I wouldn't be surprised. Maybe we see an extra linebacker. Maybe we see that 3 set. With Diabate, Corene, and Lander, just trying to fill in on those edges. But it's going to be important that the defensive line and obviously the linebackers there as well have a big game, or else UCLA could pull one on Utah.
They could, and this is a UCLA team that could that we do think are they as good as maybe the top 15 team? No, but that doesn't mean they couldn't get an upset against Utah teams. And the Utes know that. I think they're going to come into this one ready and with that mindset to be aggressive. And yeah, the defensive line. I think I definitely I overhyped the defensive line this year. I think I just got really excited about the progress we saw from Van and I think Junior as well. And I thought those guys would make a leap and really be. And I still think they are two of the best defensive linemen overall, but I
Yeah,
thought they would be like clear, like, wow, that's one of the best pass rush duos in the country. And I just don't think Junior has been able to have that same success as he did but he broke out later in the year as well last year, I'll say. So, and he had a lot of his sacks in kind of singular games. So he could still do some good things later in the season. And then Van's another guy as well, who I just think he's still figured out a couple of things just because he is so young. I think I expected
mhm,
those guys to take a bigger jump. And then you talk about guys like Connor O'Toole. I mean, he's playing an entirely different position. Gabe
right.
Reed is still acclimating a little bit as well. So they've done some nice things. And Aliki Vaimahi, Samote Pepa, I think those are guys who still do a good job as well. But it's
Yeah,
definitely not a dominant unit, as you said, that has been, I would agree, underperforming.
and there's not a ton of experience. You don't have
No.
guys that have been out there for 2, 3 seasons. You even guys like Van and Junior. They haven't played a ton of snaps, and then
Junior didn't,
you
I
bring
don't think Junior played in the very first game of
he did
last
yeah
season. I believe I saw.
he
Yeah.
didn't start. Yeah, he oh gosh, who did he I'm trying to remember who he replaced because
I can't remember off the top of my head either.
someone went down in that first game, and then he
Mhm.
he started. I don't even know if it was the second game. I feel like
Yeah.
someone went down maybe game 2 or so. But
Yeah, I
anyways,
don't
yeah,
think he did
he
much versus
he
BYU. You're right.
yeah, he didn't start, the first handful of games last season. Van is still fairly young. I think he played in 2020, a little bit, but then
Yes.
obviously, coming into a starting position in 2021. And then, yeah, you have, other, young guys that don't have a lot of experience, Connor O'Toole and Jonah Ellis and even Mickey Suguturaga. Like,
Mhm.
these are guys that have not played a ton of reps and they're still doing a pretty dang good job. Give this defensive line another season, or maybe if these guys, make it into senior years, that's going to be maybe the best defensive line in the country. But they're still young.
Mhm.
I think Utah fans are just kind of holding them to this a little bit of an out ridiculous standard of, oh man, like these guys are so overhyped and they're not that good. It's like, okay, maybe they were a tiny bit overhyped.
Mhm.
I think what we're seeing now is a little bit of inexperience and they're just underperforming. So I think at the end of the day, they are still very, very good and some of the best at their position, I think, in the
Mhm.
nation, but they need more time.
Yeah, and they still made plays when it mattered most. You can't have a strong red zone defense like Utah did last week without those guys
Right.
winning their one-on-one matchups, and we saw those guys make those plays when it did matter. So it's definitely a group that's capable of stepping up and doing those things, and they have a fun challenge against UCLA because we remember back to that Florida game. I remember Van Fillinger getting his hands on Anthony Richardson and him shaking out of those tackles. And if Van gets his hands on DTR, I expect him to be able to drag him down, but getting his hands on DTR is going to be extremely difficult because of how shifty and tough just to track down he is. So it's going to be fun to see how this one plays out and staying with that, Cole, as well. It's predictions time. So how are you feeling about this one?
I think Utah wins. I really do not give UCLA home field advantage.
I know.
I mean, sure, they they had quite a
There might be more Utes in the crowd. We really don't know.
yeah. I mean, Utah knows how to pack the Rose
They
Bowl.
travel well.
UCLA has not proven to be able to do so. I don't expect as many Utah fans there as we did, on January 1st. But yeah, I don't think home field advantage is really going to be a big thing. UCLA has really struggled to fill that stadium. Sure, they filled it last week, but I think they gave away about 65 or 70% of those tickets. So home field advantage is not a thing for me in this one. Utah has, I think Utah has the better offense and the better defense. I think the offense might be a marginal. Um, you know, it's tough, but I think I'm just going to go with what I said earlier. I think it's Utah by 2 possessions, whether that's 10 or 14 points. And I think this one is fairly high scoring. Maybe we see 60, 70 points put up between the two teams. So that's what I'm just going to stick with that. I'm going to say we're going to see 60 or 70 points combined, and I think Utah by 10 to 14 points.
I like it. And I'm right in that range as well. I don't think this is a 20-point blowout, but I do think Utah wins by more than 10 points. And look, we talked about UCLA's schedule a little already, but Bowling Green, Alabama State, South Alabama, Colorado, Washington, all of those teams except for Alabama State put up more than 10 points. Actually, they put up more than 15 points against this team. And this is the best. I think this is the best offense they play. And it's an offense as well that's still hungry, that hasn't put together a complete game in many respects. Every game you can
Right.
point to something that didn't work or didn't go right for them. So I think they're coming in fired up, motivated, ready to go. Remember, Coach Witt, it's not very hard to get this group of guys motivated anyways, but he'll be like, hey, remember that feeling the last time we were here? Everyone was watching. And what happened? We still didn't win. And I think these guys are going to come out. They're going to remember that. As I mentioned, Cam will be fired up to outplay DTR once again, especially with so many people from his hometown coming out to watch him perform. And like I mentioned kind of earlier on this week's in this podcast earlier this week, I'm going to stick with what I said, and I'm going to stay with Utah. I really think this is a group it's going to end up somewhere in between. I'm going to go, I'm 36-22. I'm going to stick with what I said on yesterday's show. I do think just as I said it out loud, I just feel like this is a UCLA team that's going to be able to score a little bit, but in the end, I feel like the Utes are going to be able to come out top in this one. And Cole, if Utah comes out top in this one and USC comes out top in this one, by Sunday, we would know if Utah is going to host game day. And I personally, it's going to be interesting, right? Because they haven't been to a big time Pac-12 showdown in a long time. And
Yeah.
this one, if Tennessee loses, as well as I think there are not a ton of top 10 upset opportunities this week, but hey, you never know. I mean, there's always some surprise ones that get thrown around or thrown in there. I mean, we already saw, look, I actually think they were still top 10 there. We already saw Notre Dame lose to Marshall. It's just one of those reminders in college football, anything can happen. So I do think Utah is going to get game day, though. I think they're going to look, Michigan, Penn State's another top 10 matchup. Michigan's going to have some huge games down the line against Michigan State as well as Ohio State, of course. And I'd be shocked if they weren't at the Ohio State game this year. I think that one's just such a big time matchup. It could very well be a matchup between top 10 teams as well. Top 5 teams, excuse me. And yeah, there's a couple other ones that are like kind of intriguing, but I really think this big time Pac-12 showdown at Utah, they know the musts and the student section and everything. I think Utah would show up and make an outstanding game day atmosphere. And
Oh
I
yeah.
do think by the time I'm talking again on Monday, I think Utah will be announced as the host of game day.
You're a little more confident than I am.
Oh,
I just
Cole,
I just feel like the
believe.
national I just feel like the national media just doesn't care about the Pac-12.
Mhm.
I'm not thoroughly convinced that even if, Utah wins this game and UCLA takes care of business this week as well, that they get game day. I want it.
Mhm.
Utah's had it before and they show up every time. That's a game that, they'll be at max capacity before the game kicks. And, especially I think, you know, Utah fans don't like USC.
Mhm.
Um, so they'll show up and I think it's just going to be a special game anyways because I believe that that's the game that Utah is going to wear the Ty Jordan Aaron Low helmets, the hand painted helmets. I think, and my assumption is it's going to be the blackout game. So should the national media choose this game if Utah and USC, emerge this weekend with victories? 100%, absolutely. Do I think that they're going to? I would say the odds are not in favor of that, but I hope I'm wrong. I just, for whatever reason, game day does not shine on the Pac-12, and hopefully they do. I mean, if Utah wins this weekend? What do you think they're ranked?
I think was hard because I don't think they would jump they're the highest one loss team. So to me, I don't think they move ahead of any of the other teams to me unless they lose. So I think they stay at 11. That's where it would be nice if a Tennessee could lose to LSU, which Tennessee, I know they're better this year. Tennessee always loses one big game a season. They're not Alabama. They're not going undefeated. I think they play at LSU, who just popped up in the rankings as well. I'm not a big Brian Kelly fan, but he's still a good coach. And that team has a lot of talent as well, led by Jaden Daniels. So I do think they're going to get an upset there. So I actually do think by the time this week ends, Utah is a top 10 team, and we know USC is going to be a top 10 team. Or at least I hope they avoid the upset against Washington State, because if they lose, then they're definitely not coming to the game.
I don't. Is it in Pullman or is it in LA?
I believe it's in Pullman.
That could
I know.
turn. I mean, I think USC is a little bit of a fraud too.
Mm-hmm.
The way that they barely
Their
beat Oregon
defense,
State.
yes. Defense,
Oh
definitely.
yeah, defense is not good. Defense is not.
They just
Their
get
off.
capitalized on turnovers.
Yeah, well,
They're
and
fluky turnovers too. It's not like
yeah,
they're playing outstanding.
it's primarily the offense that went out and signed all those
Mm-hmm.
free agents. Excuse me, that went out and paid kids in the transfer portal. That's the
There you go,
correct
Cole. Yeah.
way to describe that. Sorry. The defense didn't really do that, and they were not good last year, and they're definitely not that great this year. And again, kind of a schedule that hasn't really shown who they really are.
Mhm.
Utah is going to show who they really are. This week, I think Utah, reveals UCLA as a fraud. I think next week, I don't know that they'll reveal USC as a fraud necessarily, but I don't think I don't think USC is going to be as good. But and to me, Washington State's a scary team. That's
Yes.
like
Oh, yeah.
I think they have developed into that dark horse team in the Pac-12 this year. They're good. They almost pulled up an upset against Oregon. They should have. That was ridiculous.
I
That's
think off the top of my
disappointing.
head, they have the best win of the season. Going to Wisconsin, winning at Camp
Yeah.
Randall is a more impressive win in and of itself than any other Pac-12 team does. Way more. It's not okay. I will say way more impressive to me than what Washington did, because Michigan State the very next week got blown out by Minnesota as well. And Minnesota's a really good team as well, but we're just kind of seeing this Michigan State team isn't
Right.
as good as we thought it was going to be. And Wisconsin's disappointing a little bit as well, but just going on the road into one of the most hostile environments in college football and winning is extremely challenging. So I absolutely
Yeah.
agree with
Yeah, so and Pullman's not an easy place to
you.
win
Mhm.
either. They love their football. That's all they've got there. It's a small town that loves their football team. And so, I USC is not going to have an easy game this week. And when the Utes play Washington State at the end of this month, that's a game I've got circled too. I honestly might be more worried about that game than I am with this UCLA game, just because
Mhm.
I think
I can
Washington State's
understand
a
that.
dark horse. That Utah be coming off a bye week. It's a short week. and Pullman is going to be hostile. Plus, Washington State wants revenge on
For sure.
Utah because of what's happened.
It
But anyways, I I still think the chances are slim, even if both teams emerge with victories this weekend. I think one team's going to lose.
Mhm. Oh, you do?
I do. I just
Yeah.
whether it's USC or Utah, I think USC has a higher chance of losing.
Yeah.
I think one of these teams is going to lose, and I don't think they're going to get it. But I hope I'm wrong. I hope
Yeah.
both teams win, and I hope that Utah, I hope a top 10 team loses and Utah jumps up to 10, and that USC is what are they 6?
I think so. Something like
So
that.
6 and 10. That's really tough to turn your head. Even though I don't think College Game Day likes Pac-12
Yeah.
settings, but it is what it is. We'll see. I hope I'm wrong, but I think one of these teams loses this week, and that blows
Cole, I don't think I've ever said this to one of my guests before, but I also hope you're wrong as well. I
it.
really hope that Utah is able to come and get this game day, but it's going to be interesting to see. And you make a ton of great points as to why they're not. And if you guys are looking to see Cole make a bunch of other great points as well, make sure you follow him at Bagley_Cole on Twitter, as well as check out FanNation AllUtes. He's churning out daily great content every day and ton of fun stuff coming up, previewing this UCLA game, and then no matter what the results are, previewing the USC game as well. So it's going to be a fun one. Appreciate Cole as always for joining us. If you guys are in the market for a second listen every day, make sure you check out the Locked On Pac-12 podcast, where host Spencer McLaughlin, other local experts will take you around the conference in under 30 minutes. Lots of fun game previews coming up, and what's going to be another exciting slate of Saturday football across the Conference of Champions. So thank you all for tuning in to Locked On Utes this week, and thank you all for subscribing to our YouTube channel as well. That's going to do it for this week, but we'll see you next week on Locked On Utes.